And what our children need today is definitely not a diet of murder, violence and immorality on television. Our children need to be taught the moral principles God has given us. The moral law of God protects you and me and our children. God's law is not some arbitrary regulation to restrict our happiness. God's law is the pathway to freedom and genuine happiness. God's law protects you and me from a lifestyle which would destroy us. Some Christians have even said, we don't preach on the law in our church, we preach about His love. As if these are two different things. Friend, love always leads to obedience. Love doesn't lead you to disobey God. It leads you to keep God's commandments. And the Bible says, if you love me, don't keep my commandments. Friend, that is exactly what the world wants you to believe. John 14:15 actually says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Your love's response to God's saving acts in your life causes you to keep His commandments. It's the reason why we obey. It's the reason why we keep His commandments. And the reason we obey is not because we are trying to earn God's favor. It is the response of our appreciation toward Him. I do not obey God to earn my salvation. I obey God not in order to be saved, but because I am saved. And you obey God because you are saved. All our obedience does not earn salvation. Christ wrought that out on the cross. But when you and I come to the cross, our obedience is evidence that we are saved. 1 John 2 verses 3 and 4 says, now by this we know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. That's very, very clear. And John says here is the evidence that we really know God. Here is the evidence that we are really born again believers. Here is the evidence that we are truly Christ's. He who says, I know Him, and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. 1 John 2 verses 3 and 4. And when you and I are committed to Christ, when you and I genuinely know Him, when our hearts are surrendered to Him, the natural response is to obey Him. And anyone who says to you, God's law is done away with, forget about those commandments, is only teaching you half the gospel. Because grace and law are not contradictory ideas. When you are saved by grace, you are not saved to disobey. You are saved to obey. Friend, that makes sense, doesn't it? Of course it does. Now, friend, here is a good question. What is the role of God's law? First, all of salvation is by grace. And this is important. All of salvation is only because of God's grace. Old Testament believers looked forward to a Christ who would come. In the New Testament, we look to a Christ who has come. They were saved by a grace to come. We are saved by a grace that has already come. But if it's all by grace, what is the role of God's law then? Now, Paul is very clear in Romans 3 verse 20. By the law is the knowledge of sin. If you do away with law, there is no sin. If there is no law, there is no sin. By the law is the knowledge of sin, says Paul. So God reveals sin through His law. And Paul says in Romans 7 verse 7, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. If you break God's law, it is a sin. So the role of the law is to define sin. And the law says, this is right and this is wrong. The law defines the moral standard of God's judgment. The law defines the foundation of all society. The judgment in Revelation calls you and me, everywhere, wherever you are, wherever I am, back to law keeping. It calls all Christians that are saved by grace to live obedient, righteous, holy lives. Revelation's judgment does not justify our own sinful behavior. It calls us to moral responsibility. So what is the role of grace then? Ephesians 2 verse 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourself. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. So grace is God's mercy. It is God's pardon. It is God's forgiveness. Grace is God's power. Grace is God's love reaching out to you and I. Now, does grace do away with God's law? If I'm saved by grace, does that lead me to break God's law? Romans 3 verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. And Paul is here saying, don't think we do away with the law by faith through grace. We keep it, we establish it. So people who are saved by grace are obedient people. Matthew 5 verse 17 is very clear. Do not think that I came. This is Jesus speaking personally. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Jesus didn't come to do away with the law. He was the living law. And Jesus himself obeyed the law. He fulfilled it. Romans 6 verse 14, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. When does sin have dominion over you? When you follow your own way rather than God's way. When you flippantly go out and break God's law, then sin changes you. It changes you because the Bible says sin is the transgression of the law. And Paul says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. So what does it mean to be under the law? It means to be under the law as a method of salvation. And the book of Galatians is very clear on that. It means to be under the condemnation of the law because I broke it. It means I trust the law to save me and I don't keep it anymore. So I'm condemned.